Once upon a time in Montana, back in 1925, there were two brothers named Phil and George Burbank. They were ranchers, taking care of the land their mother left them. Phil, the older brother, had a habit of teasing George by calling him Fatso. Phil admired a cowboy named Bronco Henry and often spoke highly of him. One day, the Burbank brothers and their group of cowhands embarked on a cattle drive. They made a stop at an inn where a widow named Rose Gordon lived with her son Peter. Peter had a lisp and had a passion for art. Rose worked hard to serve the ranchers food and drinks. On the table, there were some paper flower decorations that Peter had made. When Phil noticed them, he and the other men made fun of Peter's work, comparing it to a woman's. To make matters worse, Phil carelessly burned one of the flowers with his cigarette while telling a story about Bronco Henry. Seeing this, Rose quickly removed the remaining flowers from the table. Phil also shouted at a nearby piano player, demanding him to stop playing. Later that night, George overheard Rose crying alone. He discovered that she was upset about how Phil treated Peter. Phil defended his hurtful comments, claiming that Peter needed to act more normal. George, however, spent more time with Rose and showed her genuine kindness. Eventually, they fell in love and got married, much to Phil's displeasure. He believed that Rose only married George for his money. Frustrated, Phil took out his anger on a horse in the barn. With Rose moving in with George, he decided to organize a dinner party to introduce her to his parents. The couple went on a peaceful picnic, where George finally felt a sense of belonging. However, Phil continued to be rude to Rose and accused her of scheming. One night, he overheard Rose and George being intimate, which enraged him. Seeking solace, Phil retreated to the barn and gazed at a shrine dedicated to Bronco Henry. At the ranch, there were two housekeepers named Lola and Mrs. Lewis. One day, George surprised Rose with a grand piano so she could play music. However, Phil rudely interrupted her, playing his banjo to deliberately throw her off. He even played expertly to taunt her further. George tried to talk to Phil about their parents and the upcoming visit from the governor, but hesitated to ask him to clean up after seeing him covered in mud from swimming earlier. The elder Burbanks, known as the Old Lady and the Old Gent, arrived by train to a warm welcome from George. They were accompanied by Governor Edward and his wife. While Rose attended to her in-laws, George once again tried to get Phil to join them, but Phil stubbornly refused to clean himself up. The elders asked Rose to play the piano, but due to nervousness, she could only manage a few notes of the Radetzky March. The situation worsened when Phil swaggered in and continued to belittle Rose in front of everyone. This pushed her over the edge, and she resorted to drinking. Peter, Rose's son, came to stay at the ranch for the summer. Unfortunately, Phil and his crew continued to taunt and tease the boy relentlessly. Rose's drinking spiraled out of control, and Peter mostly stayed in his room. One day they discovered a rabbit in the field, but when Lola went to check on it, she found Peter dissecting the poor animal in his room. The tension and troubles on the ranch were building up, setting the stage for a series of dramatic events that would shape the lives of the Burbank brothers, Rose and Peter, in unexpected ways. Phil and his men go by a lake to bathe. Phil, feeling a bit adventurous, wandered off into a nearby field all by himself. He takes a handkerchief that belonged to Bronco Henry, and he got a rather curious idea. He began using the handkerchief for some private activities that made him feel good. Meanwhile, Peter found a secluded spot and stumbled upon a stash of old magazines that had once belonged to Henry. Those magazines featured pictures of naked men, something Peter found both fascinating and bewildering. As he explored further, he eventually came across Phil bathing near the lake. However, Phil quickly shooed him away, not wanting to be caught in the act. Time passed, and the cowhands gathered together in a field. Rose and Peter joined them, and Phil called Peter over, fully aware that it would make Rose uncomfortable. He offered to teach Peter how to make a lasso from rawhide, just like Bronco Henry had taught him. Phil was determined to pass on his skills and knowledge to the younger generation. Later on, Rose expressed her concerns to Peter about his growing closeness to Phil, feeling uneasy about the amount of time they spent together. During Peter's horse-riding lessons, he struggled to stay on the horse, which became a source of amusement for the other cowhands who couldn't help but laugh. Eventually, he managed to overcome his difficulties and rode out into the vast land. There, he stumbled upon the remains of a cow carcass. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to take a piece of the cow's hide, using gloves to protect himself. Phil took Peter out on their horses for a fencing job, much to Rose's dismay. Unfortunately, she was too late to stop them as they had already ridden far away. Along the way, they encountered a rabbit and Phil skillfully killed it. However, in the process, he ended up with a deep cut on his hand. They sat down under a tree to rest, and it was during this moment that Peter opened up to Phil about the tragic discovery of his father's body after he had taken his own life, and how he had to cut him down. Mrs. Lewis informed Rose that some Native American traders had come to collect hides that Phil had stored. However, upon learning that Phil planned to burn them, the traders left. Out of spite towards Phil, Rose decided to give the traders the hides, and in return, they gave her a pair of gloves. Later on, Rose got extremely drunk and passed out, but George found her and took care of her. When Phil returned and discovered what had happened, he became enraged and confronted George about Rose's alcoholism. However, Peter intervened and shared the story of how he had cut the hide, expressing his desire to be like Phil and complete the lasso. Under the cover of darkness, Phil and Peter came together to finish crafting the lasso using the hide Peter had obtained. Peter knew that the animal from which he had taken the hide was diseased. Phil, despite his open wound, washed the hide in the water, unknowingly mixing his blood with it. Peter was willing to risk everything to protect his mother. As they completed their task, Phil and Peter shared a moment, enjoying a cigarette together. Phil opened up about his connection to Bronco Henry, revealing how Henry had saved him on a freezing winter night by sharing his warmth. However, when Peter inquired about their state of undress, Phil avoided giving a direct answer. The following day, George went to check on Phil when he failed to show up for breakfast. To his dismay, he found his brother terribly ill. Phil managed to dress himself, but he was clearly delirious. In his confused state, he grabbed the finished lasso and attempted to find Peter to give it to him. George, realizing something was seriously wrong, took Phil to see a doctor. Despite the doctor's efforts, Phil's condition worsened, and he ultimately passed away. George, devastated by the loss of his brother, took on the responsibility of choosing a coffin for his burial. After Phil's funeral, George spoke to the doctor, who suggested that Phil might have died from an anthrax infection. This was a surprise to George since Phil had always been careful with the hides he worked with. Peter decided to stay home instead of attending the funeral, keeping the lasso hidden under his bed. He found solace in reading a verse from the Book of Psalms that spoke of deliverance and protection. Looking out the window, he saw George returning home and embracing Rose, a heartwarming sight that brought a smile to Peter's face. From that point on, George and Rose maintained their relationship, and both Rose and Peter found a greater sense of happiness and contentment in their lives. The movie comes to an end. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe button. See you in the next video.